My name is Nikki Swift, and today I'll be presenting on the use of research methods on canine behaviour management. This presentation forms part of Module 12 for the Dog Genius Institute Level 6 Diploma in Behaviour and Training. So this is a summary of what we'll cover in the presentation. We'll begin by looking at why research is so important for canine practitioners. Next, we'll look at the two types of data within research. We'll look at quantitative and qualitative data. And finally, we'll look at the ethical issues involved in research for both human and non-human participants. So why is research important to us as behaviourists? So without research, we rely on opinions and hearsay, and we might just do what we've always done rather than base our methods on actual evidence. Research underpins our understanding of learning and behaviour, and the tools and the treatments that we would recommend or even that we wouldn't recommend. Using evidence-based approaches to behaviour modification allows us to prioritise the welfare of the dog. It gives us information on what techniques are effective, the limitations of those techniques, and it also prevents the use of outdated or harmful practices. And because research is always ongoing, it also allows us to refine our methods as more data becomes available, and that might expand our current knowledge or it might contradict what we've learnt before. Some behavioural changes will also require the use of medication or supplements. So understanding the nuances of these, such as the time for the medication to take effect or any side effects or contraindications, allows us to manage client expectations. And although as behaviourists we cannot advise on specific medications or prescribe them, having this background knowledge allows us to build relationships with the professionals that do, such as the vet. There are two types of data, quantitative and qualitative, and we'll look at both of these. So quantitative data is numerical and it's measurable. In canine behaviour research, this might include something like the recording of the frequency of a dog's bark. We could measure cortisol levels as an indicator of stress, or we could assess the success rates of different training methods between different groups. The strength of quantitative research is that it allows us to test hypotheses and make statistical comparisons between groups. So for example, we might compare the effectiveness of two different training techniques. By doing this, we can calculate whether the results are statistically significant. This means that we can determine whether the results are due to chance or whether they provide reliable evidence to support a particular approach in behaviour modification. Qualitative data focuses on experiences, meanings and observations rather than numbers. In canine behaviour research, this data might be gathered from semi-structured interviews, or it might be from real-life observational studies, or even from analysing YouTube videos or media reports. Qualitative research tries to understand the why behind a situation. It helps us explore motivations and perceptions. These factors are something that numbers alone can't capture. So for example, it can tell us how an owner perceives their dog's anxiety or how they feel about different training methods. This type of research can generate large amounts of data. It can challenge existing hypotheses, or it can generate entirely new ones that can then be the subject of further research. The findings are usually presented in a narrative report using themes and examples to illustrate the key insights. So this slide is just a summary of some of the differences between quantitative and qualitative research. So quantitative, useful for numerical data, counts and measurements. Qualitative looks at experiences and perceptions. So some might say that quantitative is more narrow, more specific, and qualitative might be broader and less restricted, depending on the type of analysis you're doing. The environment for a quantitative experiment might be more controlled because we're trying to reduce all those variables that will influence the outcome. Qualitative might be more natural. However, it's important to realise that interviews and focus groups, they're still setups and they're not natural environments. The analysis of quantitative data is usually through numerical methods, deterministic or probabilistic analysis. Qualitative, it's interpretive. The researcher is looking for themes, looking for commonalities through the data. And when we report it, we would normally see quantitative data in tables and graphs, and qualitative data perhaps more in texts or narratives, although we can also use graphical representations. So if you look to the right hand side, you will see I've written reflexivity next to the qualitative data. So reflexivity is especially important in qualitative research, where researchers are interpreting the data. And it means understanding our own values, our own biases, and the assumptions that we might bring to that interpretation. So being reflexive helps to reduce bias and strengthen the credibility of the research findings. This slide presents just a few of the ways we can analyse qualitative data. There are many more ways that aren't included here. Before we go through the general aims, strengths and weaknesses of each method, it's important to say that I don't have working knowledge of any of these methods, and each one is a skill in itself that requires studying before implementing. So if we start with inductive analysis, which is a bottom-up approach, that means we don't approach the analysis with any preconceived ideas or theories. So thematic analysis, this is where the data is analysed and interpreted to identify overarching patterns and themes. It's useful when we want to identify people's experiences and opinions in general. It's a flexible method. It can be applied to many different topic areas. However, it only provides an explanatory output rather than generating new theories. Grounded theory, on the other hand, does seek to develop new theories. So this method is useful for topics where there's little or no previous research. It's flexible in that more data can be requested or gathered throughout the analysis process if it's required. It does, however, require a lot of data that can be time-consuming to collect and interpret. So now for the one that I'd rather just call IPA, Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis. This is all about how something feels to that particular individual. It is, however, less able to generalise due to the small sample size and the focus on individual interpretation. So this is usually achieved with lengthy interviews, which again can be time-consuming and they may not actually be practical. And finally, we have narrative analysis. This method uses stories to develop theories. By having this full in-depth picture, researchers are able to capture the whole story and the context surrounding it. It can show how people make sense of events through their storytelling. This process can again be time-consuming because researchers are reading and interpreting long scripts such as interviews, diaries, and biographies. Deductive methods are considered a top-down approach. For example, content analysis uses an existing hypothesis and examines the data for evidence of it. So for example, they might look at how many times a specific word or a phrase is used. This can then turn into quantitative analysis by counting the frequency of words. This can be done with existing texts without the need for further data collection. It's very systematic, but because the focus is on existing theory, the researcher might miss other patterns or trends or the context of the words and the phrases. Framework analysis takes data and maps it onto a framework. This can be deductive or inductive depending on whether you're using an existing framework or whether you use the data to develop one. It's very systematic, but it may be too rigid at times and lose some of the meaning behind the data. It's best suited for investigating policies rather than for developing new theories. So for example, as canine behaviourists, we might analyse data against the 5 Freedoms framework to assess for welfare concerns. And finally, discourse analysis. This examines language and looks beyond the words to examine how they are said. And we're looking for things like hidden meanings and relationship dynamics. Data can come from a variety of sources such as interviews, online forums, the news or documents. It does, however, rely heavily on researcher interpretation and it can be difficult to generalise. It's also a skill that needs to be learned and so it's not suitable for complete beginners. So we need to consider the analysis method before we start our research. So how do we decide which method to use? Well, we should always start with the aim of our research. For example, are we more interested in individual experiences or general patterns across society? Are we trying to develop or test a theory or just provide an explanation of behaviour? We also need to consider what data we have available to us or how practical it would be to collect the data we would require. Moving on from the analysis side, we must always consider ethics in research. So the Cambridge Dictionary definition of ethics is the study of what is morally right and wrong, or a set of beliefs about what is morally right and wrong. All research must prioritise ethics. And we'll look further at human and non-human participants in the next couple of slides, but we must also consider the ethics of the research itself. So the two main issues here are fraud and plagiarism. Fraud is being deceitful about the methods or the results. And we can try to minimise this by including peer reviews of the research and also when the research is replicated or indeed if it can't be replicated. Plagiarism is presenting someone else's work as your own. So this can be minimised by good note taking, including references, and there's also software available to do these checks. Now let's talk about research ethics when working with human participants. It's not just about following the law, it's also about keeping participants safe and making sure people can trust the research outcomes. Universities or organisations that carry out research will have a committee dedicated to looking at research projects and checking that the ethical choices being made are the right ones. There are different ethical frameworks for different industry sectors, such as health, social science, or education. The ones that we're looking at just now, these are taken from the British Psychological Society. It's their code of ethics, and we'll go through these one by one. So, risk. Researchers must ensure participants are not harmed, either physically or psychologically. This includes being aware of any potential risks before the study begins and continually monitoring participants throughout the research. Where risks are identified, these must undergo a cost-benefit analysis and be approved by the Ethics Committee. Valid consent. So consent should always be documented in a written form. It should be informed, so participants should be fully aware of what the study involves. However, sometimes participants will only know what they're doing and not why they're doing it. Sometimes this is required in some designs to avoid participant bias, and we'll talk more about that in a second. It should be voluntary, so participants should not be coerced into doing it. There should always be the ability to withdraw at any point. Participants might be offered incentives to participate, but the incentive should not be large enough to compromise a person's decision to freely participate, as that would then start to come under coercion. So if they're only doing it because they're getting something for it, that would start to come under coercion. If something in the study changes or the study occurs over a long period of time, the participant should be given the option to renew their consent. Confidentiality. So under the Data Protection Act, collected data is considered confidential unless formally agreed otherwise. Participants should be allowed to remain anonymous, and if this isn't going to be the case, participants should be made aware of this through the consent procedures. Confidentiality helps the research outcome, as participants are more likely to be honest and truthful. Giving advice. If giving advice is part of the research proposal, then this should be reviewed and agreed beforehand by the research committee. If, however, it becomes clear during the research that withholding advice would put the participant at risk, then we are ethically obliged to do so. If the participant asks for advice, then this can only be given by a suitably qualified individual. Deception. So deception means withholding information, and it's sometimes necessary to reduce participant bias. What this does is compromise informed consent. So it must always be justified and ethically approved, and its use should be minimised wherever possible. And finally, debriefing. After the study, participants may be debriefed. This debrief explains the purpose of the study, clarifies any deception used, and it answers any questions that participants might have. It also helps to counteract or minimise any potentially harmful events, There are cases where debriefing is perhaps not ethical. And so, for example, and I'll quote this straight from the book Research Methods in Psychology, which is referenced just down here in the bottom left. Straight from the book, imagine that a person on crutches stumbles in front of you and drops some books, and for whatever reason, you choose not to assist the person. It may be more damaging to learn that your behaviour was observed and recorded than it would be to simply go on your way without realising that you were part of a research project. This example highlights the complex decisions that researchers must take when it comes to ethics and how it can be subjective. So in summary, all of these principles will help ensure research is conducted responsibly and ethically, respecting the rights and the well-being of participants at every stage of the process. When conducting research with non-human animals, ethical considerations are just as important. So organisations like the Association for the Study of Animal Behaviour and the Animal Behaviour Society provide guidelines to ensure the welfare of animals, particularly companion animals used in behavioural studies. There are 3 key principles often applied, known as the 3 R's. That's replacement, reduction and refinement. So first, replacement. Whenever possible, we should aim to replace live animals with alternatives, such as computer simulations or videos of scenarios that have already occurred. This helps reduce the need for live animal involvement. Then we have reduction. This is about using the smallest number of animals necessary to achieve reliable statistical results, ensuring that no more animals than needed are used in any study. And the third is refinement, and this is about the study design itself, making sure that it's designed to minimise harm or distress. This involves planning and ethical cost-benefit assessments and improving procedures aimed to increase animal welfare. So while the 3 R's aim to minimise harm and protect welfare, they're still very process-centred rather than animal-centred. It's important to consider whether non-human animals can give consent. They can't formally agree to or have knowledge of the study, and therefore we need to make sure that we have ways to prioritise their welfare. Table 1 shown here has been directly copied from the Medical Research Council, and it's the principles that they recommend when research considers participation from adults who cannot give consent. So we're talking about humans who cannot give consent. So to summarise the main points, the interests of the individual come first, above everything else, no matter the greater good of the research. The research must benefit that individual, so it must be relevant to a condition that affects the individual. If the research can be conducted with participants that can give consent, then it should be. The benefits to the individual must outweigh any risks. If there are any indications that the participant objects to the research, then they should not be involved. The principles here are very much centred around the individual, which is different to the 3 R's framework, which is very process-centred. So there are frameworks that have been developed with an animal-centred approach, such as this one shown here, developed in 2022, which incorporates the principles of relevance, impartiality, welfare and consent. So relevance means that animals should only be involved in research where the research is beneficial to them. Impartiality refers to the different characteristics that non-human subjects are given. So that is whether they are considered sentient or whether they are companion animals compared to farm or wild animals. Impartiality means that the subjects of research are afforded the same protections simply because they are the subjects of research, and it has nothing to do with their characteristics. The third principle of welfare means that we cause no harm physically or psychologically to the subject, but it also means that we respect their autonomy, giving them choices whether to participate or not. This framework also states that we should minimise disruption to an animal's normal routine, and we should work in locations that the animal is familiar and comfortable with. The welfare of the animal should be prioritised over the benefit to science or society as a whole. Finally, we have consent, and this is considered in 2 ways: mediated and contingent consent. Mediated consent is given by someone who is familiar with the species or the individual and puts their welfare above all else. This could be a legal guardian or an ethics committee. Contingent consent is given by the individual animal theirself. So this involves allowing them to familiarise themselves with the environment beforehand, but also allowing them options to withdraw if they choose to do so, by having exits and comfortable rest areas available. Contingent consent should be consistently monitored, so we're looking for body language signs that might indicate welfare issues. So to conclude, research plays a critical role in providing evidence for humane and effective behaviour management. Both quantitative and qualitative methods offer different, unique insights. Each is valuable on its own, but we can also combine them in a mixed methods approach to provide more comprehensive understanding. And it's essential that the research aims and analysis methods are clearly defined before designing the study structure. Planning ahead ensures we collect the right data in the correct way and also that the results are meaningful. Finally, ethics are non-negotiable, and as canine practitioners, I would suggest that we should be aiming towards a dog-centred approach to this, where dogs are involved in our research. But whether we are working with human or non-human participants, or both, following ethical guidelines protects them. It also facilitates more truthful, trustworthy research outcomes. Thank you for listening. The following slide lists the references used within the presentation.